This is an overview of new functionality in the Radiance photon mapping extension. It's been around for quite a while. Originally, it was officially integrated into the distribution in 2015. Before that, it was around just a patch separately when I developed it at Fraunhofer back in the late 90s, early 2000s. The stuff here is relatively new, although quite frankly, it's about 4 years old on average, being born out from collaborations in two projects, namely the Photon Flow or 3D Light Flow project with the Tokyo University of Science. The colleagues from Tokyo will be presenting their results from a perceptual experiment in which they used photon mapping tomorrow afternoon. And also my collaboration with my colleagues Lars Gorber and Stephen Wasilewski, then at Hochschule Luzern in Switzerland. That being said, the stuff that I'm presenting now is currently not in the release for reasons that we'll go into, or basically that Greg has already touched on. I'm going to start off with just a quick outline and an introduction on what photon mapping is and what it's good for, because I think there may be some neophytes in the audience who aren't familiar with the concept. I'll concentrate on the new photon types that have been added. It's 3 in number. And then just a quick view at some of the options that I've added to the 2 main tools that come with the photon mapping extension, make PMAP, which generates the photon maps, and PMAP dump that, well, outputs photon info for further analysis. And I'll conclude on the current status of the code, which frankly is not much of an update. It's a non-update really, because it hasn't changed, but basically where it is and what still needs to be done for it, to it. And I'll close with an overview of what's planned. So quick introduction, crash course into what photon mapping is. It's basically a ray tracing algorithm, very similar to what Radiance does, standard Radiance or Radiance Classic, as we like to call it, as implemented in tools like rtrace and rpict. The crucial difference is that unlike sending rays from the sensor positions or the camera, in the case of rpict, towards surfaces and via one or several bounces tracing back to the light sources, photon mapping works the other way around. It sends rays from the light sources and bounces them around, and wherever they hit indirectly, it stores a quote light packet, i.e. photon, consisting of its position and the energy it carries. Photons are then scattered probabilistically depending on the surface properties, that is BSDF, and can also be absorbed depending on the reflectance. And if left to run to completion, you get something, a distribution that you see on the bottom right there. These points are your actual photons, and the collection is basically your photon map. And this constitutes a pre-computed solution to the indirect lining. And this can be used then to link to rtrace and rpict to reduce redundant paths. And when you load a photon map like this, say to 5, when you load an rtrace, rpict, it will send rays from the sensor position, look up the nearest photons, and then thereby link to the forward paths that were generated by the Make PMAP tool. That's the tool that generates the photons. What you wind up with then effectively is a bidirectional ray tracer. And by definition, because the photons, because they are spread out as they propagate in space, and because they are terminated depending on reflectance, the density of the photons on the surface corresponds to the irradiance or illuminance. So this, in mathematical terms, this reduces to a classic density estimation problem. The reason you want to do all this is because it excels at simulating specular to diffuse transfers, as you get them basically from any form of light redirection, particularly if you're using curved reflectors as opposed to planar ones. So if you're simulating in practical terms fenestrations that include specular blinds, retro-reflecting blinds, anything with microprisms, or a classic example, light pipes, then this is really your go-to algorithm. So it occupies a niche in the Radiance application field, but it is, it takes a bit of expertise to get the parameters right. Any questions on that? None? I'll go ahead then. So the first photon mapping type I'll be looking at is the so-called light flow photon, or as the colleagues in Tokyo call it, photon flow. This is an extension of the already existing volume photon map. The idea here is to not only evaluate illuminance on surfaces, but also in space, in an interior, particularly for the evaluation of light fields, for example. Colleagues in Tokyo use it for, I don't know if you can hear it, there's a siren going on in the background. It's gone now, sorry. They use it for perceptual experiments in light field design. The crucial difference between classic volume photon mapping is that photons are not scattered in an implicit mist, which covers the entire interior, but rather they simply pass through in the original trajectory. They are not deflected and they are not absorbed either. For those familiar with the mist primitive in Radiance, there's these two parameters, scattering albedo, scattering eccentricity. These are both implicitly set to 1. The main governing parameter is the extinction, the sigma t. This determines the optical density of the medium, and therefore how densely placed or the photons are along their paths. Typically, you want this value to be as low as possible. If you see it right now at the bottom there, this is a distribution where you have a very good coverage of the space. If you set this parameter too high, as we'll see, there we go, then you're going to have clustering along the photon paths and very little coverage in the intervening space. So that's a pretty poor solution. So that parameter is critical. The downside is as you reduce this parameter, you have to generate more photon paths, so make PMAP has to work harder and it just takes longer. There's two ways to evaluate this. One is using, you can evaluate it as mean spherical luminance at an arbitrary point in space. You can also evaluate it using Cutler's cubic illuminance, which I understand is an approximation that's used to measure light fields. This includes an asymmetric term, so you can use it to also quantify directionality, for example. And the other way is to visualize the photons as a point list exported from PMAP dump. That's what you see below, where you can just load it into your favorite point cloud viewer. The make PMAP command is pretty simple, really. Use the APV option and you specify the extinction. I'm not even sure if there's a default for that. Anyway. Another photon mapping type. This one is born out of the Light Fields project in Lucerne. This was an extension or a further development of the already existing contribution photon map, with the distinction that the bin contributions, or rather the contributions, are pre-binned and stored along with a pre-computed photon. So basically the photon acts as a representative position where a whole bunch of bin contributions are encoded. Obviously, if you store this without any contribution, compression, you're going to get a huge bunch of data. So this uses a wavelet compression scheme to effect a lossy compression on the bin contributions. So you've got, I don't know if you probably can't see my mouse pointer. In the middle there, you've got the binning from a measured sky model. This uses Shirley tube binning, and unfortunately, this is hardwired into the scheme because the wavelet transform needs a two-dimensional square matrix to operate on. What you see on the right are the resulting wavelet coefficients, and you can whittle away these coefficients, basically drop the least significant ones, a percentage of which you can specify. That is basically your compression. You don't store these dropped coefficients. By doing so, of course, as I said, it's a lossy compression, so you start to lose details. There is a compromise at some point, typically between 60 up to 80%, where it's still working. Beyond that, the artifacts become pretty objectionable, but that depends a lot on the distribution to begin with. So the downside is here that you cannot use the Reinhardt mapping that's well established in the workflows. We're still considering some kind of a resampling scheme for this as an intermediate step, but I haven't really gotten far on this. The make PMAP command, uses the APC option, and you specify the compression. It's basically just a fraction between 0 and 1 exclusive. 1 would be no contributions at all, of course. And the usual binning parameters, where the number of bins is a square. If it's not, then it's automatically rounded to 1, I believe. And the modifier is a light source modifier only. It's the modifier of the light source, or light source says, whose contributions you want to tally. And when you call out contrib and load this photon map, you have to specify the same parameters, right? It has to be, the mapping has to be consistent, the binning has to be consistent. So as a courtesy and a convenience to the user, these are automatically saved by MacPmap to an opt file, which is then passed to rcontrib with the at option. That seemed to be the easiest way, but the user has to explicitly add this, include this in the rcontrib call. Okay. Any questions on that?
Any questions? No, we're good.
Okay. Thanks. Right, third and probably weirdest photon map type and highly experimental was the, I say was because I haven't done anything with it recently. I might add the contribution photon map. I think I presented in 2 years ago in Toronto, if I'm not sure. The transient photon map I presented in Bilbao, I think a couple of years ago. I can't even remember. That I presented basically as a proof of concept. It's pretty much remained as a proof of concept. Kind of a problem, well, rather solution looking for a problem that so far didn't really exist. So it remains a bit of a curiosity, but it was a nice experiment. And so it was actually because it was simply fairly easy to pull off. So this is an extension of the light flow photon map, photons occupying space, basically, flying around inside, but with the addition of a temporal term as well to each stored photon. So not only do you store the position of the photon, its energy, but also the time when it occupies that space. And this enables you to do to simulate the propagation of light in extreme time dilation. It uses as shown in this video below, this is basically just a series of frames generated by rpict. One of the downsides of this implementation is that it uses the old k-dimensional tree data structure. This has limitations, particularly in terms of performance. When you have a very large number of photons, beyond 250,000 or something, it gets pretty slow. And also it does not perform well with more than 3 dimensions, but it's easy to extend to an arbitrary number of dimensions. So adding a 4th dimension was a no-brainer. these photon maps are generated with, again, with make PMAP, obviously using AP capital T option. I believe AP lowercase t is the surface bound variant, which is not really useful, quite frankly, because you don't see the photons in the intervening space. And capital T is the the volumetric variant. And what you have to specify is the speed of light. This is because only you know what units you use, what units your model is calibrated in, whether it's meters or millimeters or whatever, or even inches. You have to then adapt the speed of light accordingly and pass that in if you want to be, physically realistic. But there's actually nothing stopping you from, giving some completely absurd value there. The only thing you can't do is give a negative value, because not even Radiance can reverse the space-time continuum, unfortunately. If you want to render a video like this, you basically generate a bunch of frames, point in time renderings using rpict, and you specify the point in time with this additional parameter t, in which case rpict will then, for each pixel, wherever it hits, will not only locate the photons in the spatial, but also in the temporal domain. So again, the photons that occupy that space at that particular point in time t. There is obviously some blurring going on because it's a density estimate. So you have some smearing, basically. That's just bias going on. That's inherent to density estimation, but I won't get into those details. Anyway, it's in there for anybody who wants to muck about with it, but I guess for now, it just remains a proof of concept.
Roland, I have a question on that.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So is it an instantaneous burst of light that comes from all of the sources, or
yes,
is
it
there
is.
like
yeah. This is a bit of this is actually a question that I think came up in Bilbao too. People weren't exactly sure what at what point the photons are emitted. It is actually the case that at T0, all photons are emitted at once from all fenestrations. Those are, of course, photon ports. But yeah, they all basically emit at one point and then more or less collide in the middle in the staircase.
Okay, and then for each frame, is there a band of time, like in I don't know, nanoseconds or whatever? So it's like, can you adjust that band of time depending on your model and what you're trying to show?
There's basically two parameters that govern that. One, this was generated with a Python script that I custom bodged together to get this. That, of course, iterates over a certain, as you say, a delta t, where you can specify, and this is the parameter t that you then pass to rpict. Due to the nature of the density estimate, you also have a finite, weight. So the density estimate, think of it as a Gaussian weighting distribution, both in space and time. So the further away your photons are spatially and in time, in other words, if it's photons that have moved on since point t, they also still contribute a bit. And this is why you see these smearing artifacts. The only parameter that controls that is this bandwidth parameter here. This is the number of photons that you look up in the neighborhood, right? And this is the spatial and the temporal neighborhood. The time t in the photons is actually not stored as time, it's stored as the path length. And the reason for that is because the path length is in the same units as the position, right? They're both spatial parameters. And that seemed to make more sense to me than to have t in arbitrary, milliseconds and nanoseconds, as you say, which would possibly skew the lookup then. So the bandwidth is one parameter. If you reduce this, you're going to get away. You're going to not have this blurring anymore, but you're going to get more noise. That's the trade-off with density estimation.
Okay,
and
thank you.
And of course, the script, that's I think that's actually in the repository too. That I'll give you the address at the end. Okay. Any more questions?
Any more questions? Nope.
Thanks. Okay. So MakePMap is a tool that generates the photon maps. There's just one small handful of options, or there might be a few more, but they're not really, not a big deal. The one big deal, a bigger deal, is this polyhedron region of interest. So first of all, region of interest means that you can specify a region in which you want to store photons exclusively, just to make them, maximum use, make it more efficient, right? You don't want, if you don't know that you don't want to look up photons outside this region, and your sensors are all going to be inside this region, there is no point storing photons outside. So this just makes it just much more efficient. There's a rectangular region of interest, which can be used for standard room geometries, things like that. But beyond that, if you have an odd geometry like this example here, an octagonal ground plan, and on top of which a building which is incidentally, it's not obvious here, but this building is actually inclined from the vertical. This is where I came up with this polyhedron region of interest. Basically, you specify a bunch of surfaces that comprise a convex hull or polyhedron within which the photons will be contained. So any photons that leak to the outside, for example, aren't stored. And you specify this through the modifier that's used for the common modifier that's used for all the materials comprising this polyhedral hull. Region of interest. It simply uses a very simple, very dumb actually, and unfortunately quite slow interior exterior test. Sends a test ray and sees how many times it crosses such a surface of that particular modifier. That's all it does. It works, but it's just not very efficient. This is basically just a hack to get this result. On top of the rectangular region of interest, there's also a very simple spherical region of interest. Again, a no-brainer that I included just for the hell of it. Might be useful, but no big deal. Photon ports are an essential part of photon mapping, unfortunately, even though they are nothing more than a hack. That's at least my opinion to this day. Photon ports are used when, I think which is 90% of the cases, you want photons distributed on an interior emitted from an exterior source. If you don't use photon ports, the photons will you'll simply bombard this facade, and most of the photons will be bounced back and be lost. And it's just going to take forever. So the photon port, which can be any surface that you define using a modifier of that surface, in this case a fenestration, will act as an emitter in lieu of these sources, basically all the sources that it has a direct line of sight to. And by make-illume convention, the normal of this fenestration points out. However, there are situations when the normal points in for whatever reason, and so you don't have to modify the geometry for that. You can just add a minus suffix to the APO option, which enables the ports. This just reverses the direction of emission. You can even use a zero suffix if you don't know which way the normal points, in which case it will try to emit from both sides. Oops. Yeah, and there's also an option to limit the propagation distance. I used this once only. Maybe it's useful to somebody else. If you've got a reflector in the center of a scene and you want to know how photons distribute to the environment, and you don't care about what happens beyond that, then you can limit this path distance. I used this for a PV reflection study a couple of years ago. Now, PMAP dump is the adjunct tool to make PMAP that outputs photon information. Typically, or originally, it was used actually to dump a radiance scene description of the photon distribution. But since then, I tend to use point list viewers like one you see up here, where you can dump the photon map using an ASCII ASCII dumping option, in which case you'll just get a text file consisting of the photon positions, the energy, the flux in RGB, plus additional options such as the auxiliary field. This is more of an internal functionality, which can be useful depending on the application. This is a multi-purpose field that's used for different purposes, for different photon types. So for contribution photons, it actually contains the source index of the emitting source, basically. In make PMAP in the forward pass, it also contains the bin of that particular photon before the precomputation. In transient photons, it stores the time of flight, which, as I said, is actually the path length, which, if you know the speed of light, then it's just, the time of flight. And for all other photon types, it's just a unique path idea, which, I don't know, might be useful if you want to identify a particular photon. There's also an option to output the normal of the surface at the photon position. In the case of a volume or light flow photon map, it's actually the direction of the photon. This is, I believe, what the colleagues in Tokyo will be presenting tomorrow. They use this particular option for their experiments. Any questions on that?
No questions.
Thanks. Right, status of the code is, well, I've done some refactoring, some cleanup. There's about 12 new modules, source modules in there now, particularly to support the wavelet transform. Also the encoding of the wavelet coefficients, that's this mRGBE module. Those two particular modules also contain unit tests now because they were quite critical and quite tricky. They gave me a lot of headaches, quite frankly. But this is, I think, a habit I'm going to get into in the future to include unit tests. There were a couple of bugs, some of them quite embarrassing, really. These are only the ones I really remember. I know that there was at least one bug which fixed potential hangs in make PMAP in the photon emission loop. Another one which I missed for a really long time and was really just not that obvious was that under certain circumstances, the out-of-core data structure, which is now used typically for photon mapping, can accommodate much more photons. It uses an octree to store the photons, and under certain conditions during photon lookups, it would not descend into, I believe, the 8th quadrant. Also, there were issues when using irregularly shaped photon ports. Photons were just lost. They were not registered, so there was bias there. This was typically when you have very skinny, crazy triangles from a triangulated polygons. And this version also includes Lars's fabulous, super spectacular specular fix. Yeah, another embarrassing bug. This one manifested itself by missing highlights on specular surfaces, which were generated by reflections from transmitted external sources, right? So this was due to a heuristic that suppressed potentially double counted contributions when using caustic photon map, because those paths would be accounted for in caustic photons. The problem was there was no efficient way of dealing with this, figuring out if this component was actually needed or not in our trace, without actually tracing the ray through the glass, at which point you've expended the very effort you were trying to save. Lars astutely observed that this had to be handled in the forward ray tracer, that is in make PMAP, and modify the scattering routines accordingly, forward scattering routines, to, I believe, set a flag to indicate whether a photon was redirected or passed straight through. And only if it was redirected was it actually stored, because that component was not rendered by Radiance. So that's in there now. Lars has stress tested it. He guarantees that it works. Honestly, I don't understand it fully, but I'll take his word for it. But good job, Lars, really. Anyway, code status. The code is still in a repository, in the C4Science repository in Switzerland. This is the URL along with a second one for the current documentation, which also includes a technical report. As Greg has already mentioned, the move to hyperspectral rendering has brought about a breaking change, and I understand that photon mapping doesn't work anymore. So at the moment, photons store RGBE as flux, and that does not seem to work anymore. I believe it actually segfaults. So at the very least, I have to get it working at least just for 3 wavelength bands. There were plans to do a C++ refactoring in kind with what Greg has done with the main ray tracing engine. Unfortunately, we didn't get the funding for that, so that is now unfortunately shelved. Future plans, obviously, we finally have to merge with the head release once we get the hyperspectral stuff working. In the long run, we want to get true hyperspectral support working. I have a few ideas how this could work in photon mapping. Nevertheless, I also, of course, have to also include support for the spectrally modified materials that are now also have been added. So it's actually quite a tall order. One of the ideas that I discussed with my colleagues in Tokyo was to modify PMAP dump to accept a point in time and dump photons, around this point in time. The idea being that we can then generate dynamic VR geometry to visualize photons in motion. They'll discuss that idea tomorrow afternoon as well in their presentation. And that's it. Thanks very much.
It looks like Greg has a question.
Clarification, Roland, the photon map is not broken in the alpha release with hyperspectral. It only works in RGB. That's all I was saying.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, in RGB mode, it's just the same as before. It's only if you're in a hyperspectral mode, you have to turn off the photon map for safety.
Okay. Well, that's a release at least.